So without further ado, Mr. Omar Barghouti.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the ISO, for the organizers that invited me. I'm proud to be here with you. It's not often that one meets hundreds of solid activists who know what they're doing and who don't need to be convinced why Israel is nasty and needs to be boycotted. So I'm glad to be here. Anyway, our meeting today happens also in the context of what I call the Arab Renaissance. The beginning of an Arab Renaissance that we're seeing after many, many years of Arab backwardness. We're seeing finally signs of Renaissance. And I think the Palestinian revolution, the Palestinian resistance to Israel's occupation, settler colonialism, and apartheid has always been not just a key element inspiring the wider Arab resistance movement and the recent Arab revolutions, popular revolutions, but has also been a key element in inspiring international revolutions. From South Africa to Latin America to everywhere, the Palestinian revolution has always been part of that family of popular revolutions around the world, not just in the Arab region. And people seem to forget that. It seems like something from the 60s that's no longer valid. Well, that's because many of those national liberation movements have achieved their goals, or at least their basic goals of national liberation, but we haven't. We're still at it, and it's not over yet. The Palestinian resistance has taken many, many forms over the last 100 years in facing Israel's settler colonialism, Zionist, and then Israel's settler colonialism. And peaceful resistance has always been a key element in that resistance. It's just not talked about. It's always, the media focuses only on one form of resistance, which we're proud of. We're not ashamed to have armed resistance as well as peaceful resistance throughout our existence. People under occupation have a right to resist by all means. And you know, when we hear some of our French comrades tell us, you know, we're so glad BDS is out there now. Actually, somebody actually told me this, a socialist person in France. We're so glad because it's enough with, you know, violence and, you know, terrorism, and it's good that you're focusing finally on nonviolent resistance. And, you know, it is, of course, BDS is as nonviolent as it gets. There's just no physical contact. You're just boycotting. So that's as peaceful as it gets. But I told her, you know, I normally am nice, but I won't take this from a white person lecturing us about nonviolence. And I added something that may have sounded racist, that, you know, the white race is like the most violent in the history of mankind. Just look at World War I and II and the Holocaust and, you know, and on and on and on, and colonialism. And you just don't lecture us about violence and non-violence. Regardless, BDS is certainly a very non-violent movement by definition. It's calling for boycott, divestment, and sanctions. It is inspired by a long history of Palestinian struggle against settler colonialism and occupation, and also by the South African anti-apartheid movement. The most important factor that has affected the Palestinian BDS movement is the South African anti-apartheid struggle. To a lesser extent, the civil rights movement in the US and the Indian revolution against the British, Gandhi. But it's mainly inspired, rooted in Palestinian civil resistance. Why should this concern a wider American public? I know it concerns people in this room because you're conscientious, you're progressive. But when we try to expand BDS to wider mainstream circles, and it should be expanded because BDS is not, as I always say, a socialist agenda. It's a very liberal agenda. It calls for freedom, justice, and equality. We should really try to get all the liberals out there to adopt BDS because it's basic human decency. You don't have to be Marxist to support it. But of course, if you are Marxist, you'd better support it. I was in London for the Marxism Festival 2011, which is a huge socialist event there. But while I was at the meeting, I read the Financial Times, and they had this very interesting statistic that between 1976 and 2007 in the US, 58% of the total growth in income was captured by the top 1%. 58% of the entire growth in dollar value was captured by 1% of the US public. So you have major problems in this country, and you don't need me to tell you. But so why would anyone, spend any time in her or his busy schedule to do anything for Palestine? Really? I mean, other than the most progressive. Well, first, it's a moral duty. As taxpayers, you're directly responsible for our misery. Israel's occupation, apartheid, cannot possibly continue without your tax money. It's just impossible. Israel is powerful economically, militarily. It's the fourth, fifth most strongest army in the world, nuclear power, and so on. But it cannot sustain its occupation, militarization, and apartheid without US tax money. So there's a direct responsibility that comes with that terrain. Since your tax money is being abused by your government to sustain apartheid in Palestine, then there's a responsibility that comes with that. But beyond that, this statistic from the Financial Times, things are very connected. This agenda of militarization, of aggregation of power and money at the very top of the pyramid requires militarization around the world and military bases around the world and imperial hegemony, and requires Israel's existence. Israel is not getting all those billions and billions of US dollars because of its lobby alone. Yes, it does have an extremely effective lobby, and it has an Israeli-occupied Congress following its dictates, but that's not only the reason. It does serve the purposes of part of America. When they say it's good for the US, which US are they talking about? It is certainly not good for the American people. It's good for that top 1%. They sell more weapons, and the oil companies and the homeland security companies, that part of the economy certainly benefits from Israel. Israel is good for business in that sense. And it wouldn't have been as popular in Congress if it weren't for this joint interest with the top 1% of the US economy. So therefore, the struggles are connected. Our struggle against wars in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Palestine, against militarization, against imperialism, against hegemony, is connected. Israel fits perfectly within that hegemonic agenda. So there's also a responsibility that opposing this militarization and savage capitalism in this country directly benefits the peoples of the world, including the Palestinians. Addressing the social agenda in this country and shifting money away from weapons and the oil companies and the stock market and whatnot to a social agenda towards healthcare, education, better roads, saving your crumbling education system, in every aspect. Also at the Marxism Festival in London, Professor Richard Wilkinson had this extremely interesting research comparing, trying to see what causes the worst health conditions, social conditions, mental illness, and so on in the richest countries. And his book found out that it's inequality more than anything else. The US, being the most unequal of all the rich countries, has the worst indicators, social, health, mental illness. In every single indicator, it was off the charts, actually. We saw all these graphs, and it was shocking. So his conclusion was that Americans pursuing the American dream, the land of opportunity, should move to Denmark. Because the US is the absolute worst in terms of social mobility. There's no social mobility happening in this country. So Denmark is your closest bet for the American dream. So, what is BDS? Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions is a call that came out from Palestinian civil society in 2005. It was endorsed immediately by the great majority of Palestinians, represented by trade unions, women's groups, student groups, political parties, just about everyone. And when we say Palestinians, unlike what the media tells you, it's not those in the West Bank and Gaza only. It's the Palestinians, those in exile, the majority of the Palestinians, Palestinian citizens of Israel, the 48 Palestinians, and so on. Those are the three segments of the Palestinian people, not just those in the occupied West Bank, Gaza, including East Jerusalem. So it was endorsed largely by a great majority of the Palestinian people, and it called for boycott, divestment, and sanctions, but that's not the key part. The key part in the BDS call was the three rights that we focused on. The three rights, the minimal rights, without which we cannot, as a people, exercise our right to self-determination. The first right is ending the occupation and colonization of the 1967 territory, including the wall, the settlements, and so on. The second, ending the system of racial discrimination in Israel, which is a form of apartheid, and I'll talk a bit more about that. The third, and the most important, is the right of return for refugees. Without that, we won't have the minimal ability to exercise our right to self-determination, not just because the refugees are at the very core of the question of Palestine, but simply they are the majority. People who say we are in solidarity with the Palestinians, but we just want to focus on the occupation. We just want to oppose the occupation. You know, that right of return is a bit tricky and it gets into a Jewish state and whatnot. I'd rather not get into that. Those persons are not in solidarity with the Palestinian people. They're in solidarity with themselves or with Israel. They want to save apartheid Israel. They want to get rid of the occupied territories simply because it has 4 million Palestinians that Israel would love to get rid of, but after grabbing most of their fertile lands and water aquifers and so on. So that's not a Palestinian solidarity agenda. That's an Israeli apartheid solidarity agenda. Let me put it plainly. So we can understand people who support our basic rights, but then say, I want to focus in my work on the occupation. That's perfectly fine. That's different. People who say we support ending occupation, apartheid, and we support the right of return, but in my daily work, on my BDS work, I want to focus on settlements only. I want to focus on Ahava, a cosmetics company that manufactures in a colony in the occupied territories. That's perfectly fine. So when it comes to the tactics of BDS, the boycotting, the divesting, and the pushing government for sanctions, those are tactical considerations that depend on your context. Activists decide what to pick as targets and how to pursue working on that target. We defer to activists and we respect their decisions, how best to do BDS. Where we insist, what we insist on are the three basic rights. That is not negotiable. And again, that's up to the Palestinians to decide, not anyone in the solidarity movement. Being based on international law and universal principles of human rights, BDS managed to get through the barriers of the Western mainstream in a much, much faster time than our South African comrades had done in the anti-apartheid movement. And again, many people forget that. Because especially in the US, France, and some other countries, people tell you, oh, but in the South African case, I mean, it was totally mainstream. The churches and Congress people, even Congress people, were against apartheid and so on, but people have short memory. They're talking about the last part of the 1980s. The boycott in South Africa started in the 1950s. It took 25, 30 years of struggle to get there. I was personally at Columbia University involved in the anti-apartheid movement in the 80s, the good part, I mean the easiest part. And it was not easy. I mean, it was hell to get anything from the administration of Columbia to divest from companies invested in South Africa. It was really a mass struggle that took years and years. Comparatively, we're going much, much faster. And I'll just give an anecdote about one of the reasons why. Ronnie Castrils, who was a leader in the military wing in the ANC and later became a minister in the South African post-apartheid governments. I was touring with him in the UK, speaking tour, and on the train he was telling me, you know, Omar, we had some tactic that could work in Palestine. In Pretoria, we used to have those barrels with leaflets, and then we used to put firecrackers, light the firecrackers and just disappear. And then when the firecrackers go off, you know, those flyers fly all over the place and people jump to grab them and read them. And I told them, Ronnie, now we have email. So I think that's part of the reason why I mean, we have solid activists, we have just the right formula, international law, and so on, but internet played a great, great role. Without it, we couldn't have. You have a flash mob in Portland today, and the next day in Australia, they're doing something similar, and then France, and then and so on. And I just mentioned Portland because yesterday some of them were depressed that they're not doing enough, so I thought they are doing good work. But another thing that gives you an idea about how BDS is effective, I'll just give an example from the Israeli establishment. Recent quotes. When Netanyahu came back from his Congress conquest, recent conquest, Labour Party minister, member of parliament in Israel, Benjamin Fuad Ben Eliezer, greeted Netanyahu as saying the following: "We're doing very badly in Europe," he said. "And as a former Minister of Industry, Commerce and Tourism, I tell you, markets are being closed in our face. We're going through a process of delegitimization. The economic damage to our economy will be terrible." So Ben Eliezer was telling him, "You got Congress, but that's guaranteed. It's in your pocket anyway. We're losing the hearts and minds at the grassroots level. So don't be so joyful that you got the Congress people standing up and down like yo-yos." And then the smartest Zionist of them all, Shimon Peres, the president of Israel, also voiced fear that Israel might be subjected to economic boycotts and sanctions. And he said there's no need for boycotts. It would suffice for ports in Europe or Canada to stop unloading Israeli merchandise. It's already beginning. That's Peres. He's really a smarter guy. Now, what is it with this unloading Israeli merchandise? Peres is referring to a very successful campaign that we had last year, May 31st, after the first flotilla was attacked by Israel, when everybody was going so mad around the world. We said, don't let anger distract you. Let's do work. So we called on dock workers' unions around the world to stop offloading Israeli ships or loading Israeli ships, besiege Israel as it's sieging Gaza. This is the message. Dock worker unions in Turkey, India, Sweden, Oakland, California, and South Africa heeded our call and did, for varying periods in Oakland, 24 hours, but it's a very heroic 24 hours in the belly of the beast, to refuse to offload an Israeli ship. We know how difficult it is. In Sweden for a week, in India, Cochin, the fourth largest port, for several weeks, and in Turkey and in South Africa. So it's spreading. Peres knows what he's talking about. This is a movement that they cannot stop, and they realize that. Ehud Barak, the most decorated Israeli general, had this to say: "There are elements in the world quite powerful in various countries, including friendly ones," and he means you, "in trade unions, among academics, consumers, green political parties," he warns. "And this impetus has culminated in a broad movement called BDS, which is what was done with South Africa. This will not happen overnight. The day after September, the attempt to get recognition for a Palestinian state at the UN, the day after September, Israelis will say, so now October has come, the sky hasn't fallen, nothing has happened." And he says, this is not true. So Barak is certainly very worried about the rise of BDS, especially after September, but even now. So let me address some of the key issues, some of the basic arguments that come up against BDS. We don't get many debates, by the way. If you've noticed, Zionists refuse to debate us. Even soft Zionists like J Street refuse to debate us. They're so scared of debating and losing. So we end up debating ourselves. So in my book, which I shamelessly promote because I don't make a penny out of it, all proceeds go to PACB, the Palestinian Campaign for the Academic and Cultural Boycott of Israel. In my book, I have, I think, the very best arguments against BDS. I have them all. Because you won't hear them in public much, I mean, except in private, but in public, in a debate, you won't hear them. And I refute them. I try at least. You judge whether I made a good job or not. So the debate brings up some interesting issues. In the US, the most important resilient issue is anti-Semitism. That always comes up, always comes up. And there are many, many reasons. Although the US was not directly involved in the Holocaust, there isn't that guilt like we see in France, Germany, Austria, the Netherlands, Italy. We face real issues there with anti-Semitism. The US is very distant from that history, but still anti-Semitism here is extremely powerful, mainly because of the lobby power, the intimidating power of the lobby. You don't dare criticize Israel in this country without being smeared with the epithet of anti-Semitism, and that shuts the debate. You cannot criticize Israel, you cannot say anything. Or you need to be Jewish to criticize Israel, but even then you can't get away with it easily. You're a self-hating Jew, and they have all kinds of lists for those weird people who are criticizing Israel, and despite being from the tribe. And this is happening increasingly, and many, many brave, courageous Jewish activists are criticizing Israel in terms we had not heard in decades. But we should think out of the Jewish box when it comes to Palestine. It is not a Jewish issue. It's an Israeli colonial apartheid issue, and it should remain within those parameters. Saying that BDS against Israel is anti-Semitic is an anti-Semitic statement itself, because it assumes that Israel and all Jews are one and the same, as if all Jews are one monolithic lot that thinks alike, and all of them support Israel. Israel speaks for them. So if you attack Israel, you're attacking the Jews. And as I've said it before, anyone who says all Jews are, anything that comes after are, is an anti-Semite. All Jews are rich, all Jews are smart, all Jews are nasty, all Jews have big noses, all Jews are rich. Whatever all Jews are is necessarily an anti-Semitic statement, because it dehumanizes Jews. It makes them more or less human, but not human. Zionists treat Jews as superhumans, Nazis treated Jews as subhumans, but they both dehumanize Jews as a non-human species. They don't have diversity. They are all the same, the Jews. And we have to combat this very strongly. So saying BDS against Israel is anti-Semitic. Plus this issue about anti-Semitism, and I'll dwell a bit on it, I'll take a few more minutes on it. I'll just give a couple of examples. Ilan Pappe says about Israel being a democracy and so on. Ilan Pappe is a famous Israeli historian, had this to say about this Israel democracy myth, and it's connected to anti-Semitism. He says, Israel is what we in political science call a Herrenvolk democracy. Democracy only for the masters. The fact that you allow people to participate in the formal side of democracy, namely to vote or to be elected, is meaningless if you don't give them any share in the common good or in the common resources of the state, or if you discriminate against them despite the fact that you allow them to participate in the elections. On almost every level, Ilan Pappe says, from official legislation through governmental practices to social and cultural attitudes, Israel is only a democracy for one ethnic group, end of quote. Now, Desmond Tutu talks about this anti-Semitism and the guilt that causes it in the West, that causes addressing anything related to Israel as anti-Semitic. And he says, I think the West, quite rightly, is feeling contrite, penitent for its awful connivance with the Holocaust. The penance is being paid, he says, by the Palestinians. I just hope, again, that ordinary citizens in the West will wake up and say, we refuse to be part of this. But I think one of the most damning statements against this use of anti-Semitism to shut debate came from somebody at the epicenter of the Zionist establishment, Avraham Berg, who was the head of the Israeli Knesset for many, many years, head of the Jewish Agency for many years. The guy is not your typical anti-Zionist lefty. He's from the very establishment, liberal, but very much from the Zionist establishment. And he had this to say very recently. Israel sweeps all the criticism against it, both justified and unjustified, under the same anti-Semitic rug. It is actually we, Israelis, who are repeatedly mixing up proper criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism. The reason is to avoid at any price having to confront the situation and make tough existential decisions, the occupation, the injustices, the discrimination, the persecution of the non-Jewish minority in our midst. As long as they're anti-Semites, we feel pure and justified in our own eyes. And then he goes on to say, we have proven methods of coping with persecution, hatred, and pogroms, but we don't have a clue and don't have experience when it comes to openness, acceptance, and full equality for Jews, as for everyone else. That prospect threatens us in the deepest recesses of our being and confronts us with questions about our national existence as such. What Berg is saying that the Zionist establishment needed and does need continuously anti-Semitism to maintain this tribal type of solidarity. That if you're given full equality, as you have more or less in the West, for Jewish persons, it's a disaster for Zionism. What do you do about solidarity with Israel, the blind support for Israel? What do you do about that? And I.F. Stone, the famous Jewish-American writer, as far back as 1968, said that world Jewry are facing a schizophrenic situation. They're defending racist laws in Israel, and they were at the forefront of the civil rights movements in the US and Western countries. They want full equality here, but full apartheid there. Well, make up your mind. You can't be liberal here and pro-apartheid there. Some in Israel are, of course, talking about the rise of fascism. Jewish, Zionist Israelis, theater people, academics, and so on are talking about the rise of fascism. In fact, they have a declaration of independence from fascism signed by some 160 top academics and cultural figures in Israel that say Israel is fast descending into fascism. I'll just give one quote quickly, and then I'll end in a couple of minutes. One of the most important award-winning academics in Israel, Gabriel Solomon, went as far as comparing today's Israel to Germany in the 1930s. He said, quote, "The idea of Judenrein, a Jew-free zone, or Arab Rhine is not new. Some might say, how can you compare us to Nazis?" And he says, "I'm not talking about the death camps, but about the year 1935. There were no camps yet, but there were racist laws. And we're heading forward toward these kinds of laws in Israel. The government is clearly declaring our incapacity for democracy." End of quote. Other than anti-Semitism, the issue of delegitimizing Israel as a Jewish state. Let me set the record straight. Palestinians and Arabs in general have never, will never recognize Israel as a Jewish state, because that will be the end of our right to self-determination. It's just impossible. Any state that insists on being racist and exclusionary cannot demand that people recognize it. No state has a right to be a racist state. No state. Islamic state, Christian state, Hindu state, as long as it's exclusionary, it is racist and it should be resisted. We should never accept any exclusionary state, not even a Jewish state. Plus, this is an extraterritorial definition of nationality that defies international law. Any of you who knows about international law's definition of nationality, and so this is totally infringing international laws on nationality. There's no such thing as extraterritorial nationality. And Israel is the only country on earth that does not recognize Israeli nationality. It does not recognize its own nationality. It recognizes Jewish nationality, whatever that means, plus 130 others, but not Israeli nationality. Some lefty Zionists tried to go to the Supreme Court to get the Supreme Court to recognize them as Israeli nationals rather than Jewish nationals. They said, we're secular atheists, we don't want to be recognized as Jews. We want to be Israelis. And the Supreme Court shut that down. They refused, the Knesset has refused, the governments have refused. It's just not acceptable, because that would mean a semblance of equality. If you have Israeli nationality, that means Arabs and Jews are equal. And that's the last thing Israel can afford, giving equality, God forbid, to Palestinians. Another quick argument that comes up is we have to be symmetric. We have to be listening to both sides. So boycott is really bad because we have to have dialogue with both sides and we have to understand both sides. Now, I won't bore you with that because I doubt anyone here does that. What I will bore you with is when Marxists do that. Some Marxist groups, tiny groups, are coming up with the argument in some trade unions in Europe, I haven't heard it in the US, but mainly in Europe, that BDS will hurt the Israeli working class. So we should oppose it. Because working class solidarity means we should oppose anything hurting the Israeli working class. And in France, when I was faced with that question first, I said this is what I call white Marxism. This is white Marxism. This is privileging whites, including the oppressors, the working class part of the oppressor community, privileging their rights over everyone else in the oppressed community. Because we're brown, we don't deserve equal rights. So this is very white Marxism, very dangerous. And I'll just end with something unrelated to BDS, but a bit related, a wish. Some of you might have read it, but I would like to repeat parts of it. I wish you Egypt. I wish you Egypt. I wish you empowerment to resist, to fight for social and economic justice, to win your real freedom and equal rights. I wish you Egypt so you can decolonize your minds, for only then can you envision real liberty, real justice, real equality, and real dignity. I wish you Egypt so you can tear apart the sheet with the multiple choice question, what do you want? For all the answers you're given are dead wrong. Your only choice there seems to be between evil and a lesser one. I wish you Egypt so you can, like the Tunisians, the Egyptians, the Libyans, the Syrians, the Bahrainis, the Yemenis, and certainly the Palestinians, shout no. We do not want to select the least wrong answer. We want another choice altogether that's not on your damned list. Given the choice between slavery and death, we unequivocally opt for freedom and dignified life. No slavery and no death. I wish you Egypt so you can collectively, democratically, and responsibly rebuild your societies, to reset the rules so as to serve the people, not savage capital and its banking arm, to end racism and all sorts of discrimination, to look after and be in harmony with the environment, to cut wars and war crimes, not jobs, benefits, and public services, to invest in education and healthcare, not in fossil fuel and weapons, to overthrow the repressive, tyrannical rule of multinationals, they're much worse than Mubarak, and to get the hell out of Afghanistan, Iraq, and everywhere else where under the guise of spreading democracy, your government's self-righteous crusades have spread mass murder, social and cultural disintegration, abject poverty, and utter hopelessness. I wish you Egypt so you can fulfill your country's legal and moral obligations to help rebuild the ravished, de-developed economies and societies of your former or current colonies, so that their young men can find their own homelands viable, livable, and lovable again, instead of risking death or worse on the high seas to reach your mirage-washed shores, giving up loved ones and a place they once called home. You see, they're here because you were there, and we all know what you did there. I wish you Egypt so you can adopt BDS against Israel, to end the immoral hypocrisy that maintains your state's complicity in Israel's settler colonialism, apartheid, and occupation, to rekindle the spirit of the South African anti-apartheid struggle by holding Israel accountable, ending its impunity, and besieging its horrific siege, ethnic cleansing, and slow genocide. Our oppression and yours are deeply interrelated and intertwined. It is never a zero-sum game. Our joint struggle for universal rights and freedoms is not merely a self-gratifying slogan that we raise. Rather, it is a fight for emancipation and self-determination, an idea whose time has vociferously arrived. After Egypt, it is our time. It is time for Palestinian freedom and justice. It is time for all the peoples of this world, particularly the most exploited and downtrodden, to reassert our common humanity and reclaim control over our common destiny. I wish you Egypt. About the first question about the secular democratic versus binational state, this is not the right place for that, because in my capacity as a founding member of the BDS movement, I must say, as I say in the book, as I say everywhere, we do not take a position in the BDS movement on the one-state, two-state debate. We stay completely neutral. We say, regardless what the political solution is, the three basic rights have to be accommodated: ending occupation, ending apartheid, and the right of return, regardless what. So we're focusing on people's rights rather than some political outcome that, especially for solidarity movements, is not the place to discuss that. It's up to Palestinians, as part of our self-determination, to decide what shape this country will take in the future. With my other hat, I'll just say very briefly, as an advocate for a secular democratic state, I've always been for 28 years, I do not think that there's any better, more moral way to reconcile the rights of the indigenous Palestinians with what I call the acquired rights of the settler colonists, except in a democratic state that treats everyone equally, regardless of ethnicity, religion, or origin. So I think that's the most moral solution to the conflict. But again, in the BDS movement, we do not take a position. As far as the academic... And about the binationalism issue, in the book, I argue specifically why I have a serious problem with binationalism. It's a racist slogan to raise in the Palestinian question. Not that every binationalist is a racist. Yes, some of them are just have not read enough or have not thought enough about it, I think. But I think it's a very racist notion to propose in our situation, not to mention illogical, and again, it's in the book. About the academic and cultural boycott, as Sherry very eloquently said, there's a complete misunderstanding. We never, ever targeted individual academics or artists. We target Israeli institutions. And I'll just give an example about the academic institutions, because in South Africa, rugby was it. I mean, the sports was what did it to their image, their self-image. The ANC hurt the South African apartheid image by hurting them through the siege on their sports. When South African sports teams could no longer go to the world, the white minority said, that's it. We cannot tolerate life without rugby in London, and you know. If we can go to Sydney, London, and Toronto, that's not a life. That's worth living. Okay, I'm simplifying things, but sports was really important in hurting that self-image. To Israel, it's the academy. Culture to an extent, but it's the academy in Israel. Israel markets itself as, you know, this at the forefront of science and high tech and biotechnology and so on. A lot of it is mythology, by the way. And when they bring up that issue, that you want to boycott Israel, or you want to boycott this technology and that, then you throw out your computer. And my quick answer to this silly attempt is, do you want me to tell you what Germany had invented before the Nazis? I mean, since when is this an argument to make a country immune to criticism or boycotts just because they've had so many inventions? I doubt there's any country that compares to Germany up to the 1930s in its record of inventions in medicine and science and every music, philosophy. Germany, I mean, in everything. So what? If they commit genocide, if they are racist, we should boycott them regardless how much they've invented. The question about whether if the Arab revolution subside, would that hurt BDS? It would, but it won't end BDS. I remind you, we started way earlier. I mean, we had the Arab Spring way earlier before our other Arab brothers and sisters. We had it much, much earlier. And it's continuing. I mean, we cannot afford to lay back and relax. We're under occupation and apartheid, and most of our people are refugees, not allowed to go home. So we cannot but struggle. And I always say, we have, people can logically think of three options. Surrender, which is not available at all in our case. I mean, that's not an option to Palestinians. We will never surrender. We've never surrendered. Or resistance. Resistance can take many, many shapes. Armed resistance, non-armed resistance. So some liberals in the West who say, you know, I support Palestinian rights, but this BDS is too much for me. I say, yeah, you can support the Qassam if you wish. I mean, if this is too much for you, maybe the Qassams, that's the only other option. I mean, if you don't like this, you would like that. If you can't get yourself to support this minimal, morally consistent, non-violent form of resistance, then you're really not interested in supporting us. Um, Cultural boycott. Yes, I want to mention something about cultural boycott. A lot was said. All these groups that have boycotted Israel has hurt Israel more than any other aspect in the BDS realm, actually. Of all the forms of BDS, cultural boycott has been the most hurtful for the Israeli establishment so far. Again, because it's this image. Brand Israel is being attacked solidly by this. For those who don't know, Israel started a Brand Israel campaign in 2005, the Foreign Ministry, and they've invested millions and millions to rebrand Israel, to make it look like a high-tech, enlightened, white society, not connected with violence, terrorism, and this Arab Islamic thing, those barbarians. So they wanted to appear very European, very white, very nice, Beethoven, and so on. And so after every massacre, Israel sends out its dance companies and its Israel Philharmonic Orchestra and so on to whitewash its crimes. And now they're admitting it's not working. Gaza doesn't help. If you want to do rebranding, you just don't do Gaza. And the flotilla doesn't help either. Massacring 9 peace activists on a boat in the middle of the sea does not help your image. So no matter how many millions you spend, it's wasted investment, and the return on investment is really low. So they should rethink that. So the cultural boycott has been really hurting. The Knesset subcommittee on culture has met and decided to take decisive action against cultural boycott specifically. But as I've said it before, I think either smart Zionists have stopped being Zionists or Zionists have just gone dumber. I don't know what's going on. I mean, I went to Columbia University and we had very smart Zionists back then. Now we don't see them. What happened to good old smart Zionists? Anyway, so the epitome of their plan in this culture subcommittee in Knesset is that we have to be more aggressive on Facebook and Twitter. Okay. Good luck. Okay. First, thanks, Daphna. It's a very important issue that we do have partners in Israel, in the BDS movement in Israel. Boycott from Within is a group, hundreds of activists in Israel, academics, artists, anarchists, others. We also have the Coalition of Women for Peace, which is a very diverse group of women's groups that has endorsed BDS, and they put out the whoprofits.org, Who Profits from the Occupation, one of the best databases of companies complicit in the occupation, and all BDS activists around the world use that resource. So we do have very solid partners in Israel. I also want to say, in the US, our experience with BDS has been small but effective, and committed groups have done wonders. Adala, New York is one of the best examples of BDS in the world, actually. They've done amazing work with Lev Levayev and the Africa-Israel Company, forcing or pressuring UNICEF, and ultimately successfully pressuring UNICEF, Oxfam, and others to drop Lev Levayev as a supporter, as a sponsor. Ultimately, Lev Levayev decided that his Africa-Israel Company will divest itself from the settlement business. We don't know if he's done that, but he was forced to say that, and no, Israeli companies usually don't do that. They never consider settlements as something illegal or something that they cannot deal with. So I'm just saying that there's some small initiatives that have led to major victories. Jewish Voice for Peace is leading the campaign to pressure TIAA-CREF, the pension fund, to withdraw universities and health workers fund to withdraw from 5 companies, to divest from 5 companies invested in the occupation. And this is a very important campaign that the BDS National Committee has endorsed wholeheartedly. Code Pink, their campaign against Ahava, has been a very successful, very targeted, focused campaign that has spread the BDS message in very liberal circles very effectively, I think. The US campaign to end the Israeli occupation, which is the largest coalition of groups working on Palestine and the Middle East in general, is doing great work on BDS and other aspects, ending US military aid to Israel and so on. So there's so many initiatives that people can connect to and to think nationally in the US, because in the US, size does matter, clearly. So if something remains small and isolated, it will not have as much effect as something national. Israeli Apartheid Week, which is still weak in the US, It is in a few campuses, but I think every student group working on Palestine should join the Israeli Apartheid Week. It's 1 week per year, and it raises awareness about Palestine, about BDS, much more than anything else around the world. The last time, close to 100 campuses participated. So it's an amazing global phenomenon that started in Canada, and now it's all over the place. The question about investing in corporations to affect shareholders' meetings, it has been very effective. I mean, investing as in buying one share. We're not saying to buy millions of dollars. Who has them anyway? But I mean, BDS campaigners in Germany, by buying Deutsche Bank shares and going to the shareholders' meetings, were able to affect shareholders. And ultimately, Deutsche Bank, the largest bank in Germany, or one of the largest in the world, withdrew its investments from Elbit Systems, an Israeli military manufacturer, a German bank. So and about the Arab Spring's impact on the Palestinians, and the whole issue of the dialectic between the Palestinian and the Arab struggle, certainly that we cannot dream of achieving our basic rights without major change in the Arab region. It's impossible. This is why the Arab Spring is so dear to us, not just because it will help Arabs liberate themselves from their own tyrannical fetters. It will certainly help the Palestinians tremendously, and it has helped. On Nakba Day, the 15th of May, you saw the tens of thousands of Palestinian young refugees, unorganized pretty much, except the last-minute organization, walking to the borders and to the ceasefire lines in the occupied Golan Heights, in Lebanon, inside the West Bank, inside Israel proper itself, all of them wanting to return home. This was an extremely important phenomenon, totally new, completely affected by the Arab Spring. This is very inspired by the Arab Spring. It has empowered young Palestinian refugees to take matters into their own hands and to demand the right to return through peaceful means that can attract world attention. September, I haven't talked about that because it will take too long, but just very quickly, the BDS National Committee put out a statement saying before and after September, the struggle will continue for Palestinian rights because hardly anything will change. No matter what transpires at the UN, that's not where history is being made. It's on the ground in Palestine and through activists like you. And I'll just wrap up 2 minutes with a short list of victories, because I know the US is isolated from the world and, from history sometimes, but so it's good to reconnect the dots and to show you what's happening elsewhere. David Cameron, the Prime Minister of Britain, just withdrew as an honorary member of the JNF, the Jewish National Fund, after an intensive campaign that we did with the International Jewish Anti-Zionist Network and the Scottish PSC, Palestine Solidarity Campaign. We succeeded. He withdrew. He's the first Prime Minister in Britain to withdraw as honorary member of the JNF. Veolia. It was mentioned earlier, the French company Veolia has withdrawn from the Jerusalem Light Rail. It has not. It's trying to withdraw. It will take 5 years, so we'll continue our boycott. But we cost Veolia, since November 2008 till now, more than $10 billion, with a B, dollars worth of contracts. 10 billion. The Norwegian pension fund, the third largest in the world, has withdrawn from 3 Israeli companies connected to the occupation. So has the Swedish pension fund. The Norwegian pension fund is like some $320 billion, so it's a huge fund. Deutsche Bahn, a German railway company owned by government, withdrew from an Israeli project connecting Tel Aviv with Jerusalem, railway project, because it passes through occupied territories. This is the first German divestment from Israel since 1948. We've never had success with Germans, for obvious reasons, since 1948. This is the first, so it's a huge victory. Agrexco, the biggest Israeli exporter of agricultural products, is suffering massive financial crisis. Now its shares have been downgraded to junk bonds status, largely due to BDS. In France, especially, Italy, Britain, Ireland, and elsewhere, but especially in France. And I'll end with one huge achievement within Palestine. The Palestinian Trade Union Coalition for BDS was established, representing pretty much every single major trade union body in the occupied territories for representing Palestinian laborers. Finally, they were all united on supporting BDS, and they have a very clear message to world trade unions to boycott the Histad route, to boycott Israel, to divest from Israel. And I think that unity is bringing a very solid Palestinian voice to the trade union movement around the world. Definitely our South Africa moment has arrived. Definitely BDS is working, and your work can make it work more. Thank you.